Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to hopefully now round out our discussion on React, talking about components. Now, if you recall, in the last video, we were looking at some of these elements that we were rendering down. Right here, we have something a little bit more verbose, a little bit, kind of more written out, which is the, definition of verbose. But now we're going to really talk about how we can make reusable bits and bobs for our applications. And that's basically what components will get you. Now, again, I highly recommend you read through some of these links that I've got at the top here because they're going to give you handheld tutorials for how these things work. Um, I'm not going to be diving into those in this video specifically. I'll probably do one or two things, but I'm going to do those in separate demo videos so that they can take the majority of that time. Basically, the idea is with the component is that it's a reusable thing. So kind of like how you define a function or a class and you just keep reusing that over and over again with new instances or new invocations or something of that nature. Components are basically the same idea. And if you've never used them before, think of them very similar to a function in JavaScript. It is a thing that you're going to call. Make sure my hand's on the screen. It's a thing you're going to call. You're going to pass it a parameter or multiple parameters, which are going to be called props in this particular instance, which is somebody raised in the 80s and 90s. That's kind of a funny thing to say. We're giving our components props, which is great. But basically, these are just your function parameters. And what's going to come back is a React element. So we're going to create a prop. We're going to create a component, pass it in a prop, and then we're going to get some kind of an element back out of it. Again, reusable, it's a bit nice. So here's an example here on the slide. So basically, I've got a function. I'm passing in some props, which again, this looks very much just like any other function, except this is being written in JSX. It's going to be stateful. We're going to have a bit more to it than just a simple function. But the syntax is very, very similar, right? So the difference here then, I'm passing in some object, which could have anything I want in it, really, and I'm returning a element. So here you see this kind of JSX style syntax where I'm returning an h1, something inside the h1, injecting a variable, closing off that tag. The difference then is that I'm going to render this element and it's going to look actually like an HTML tag. So this is something which might be confusing if you're coming straight from HTML or JavaScript and never have touched a like a component-driven language like this. This is honestly more akin to defining an XML document from an XSL style sheet of some kind. Basically, we are defining elements in a way. That's effectively what we're doing here. So this hello there that I've got here matches up with this component. And then the name is going to be taken in as part of the prop. So basically what's happening here is that I am generating this component. Well, sorry, I'm instantiating this component. It's going to call the component here. And the props are basically going to be the attributes that we have passed along inside of this tag. So here I've got name. That's going to match name right here. Okay. And again, a lot of these things are up to you to define. I could call this something else instead of props and it would still work just fine. But basically, you just have to make sure that everything matches up. And then after that, we would render it just the same as we did before. React DOM.render, whatever we called our variable here, and then wherever we want to stick it in our document. And that's kind of the basic idea of a prop. And hopefully you can extrapolate and see how useful this is, right? I could define props for, or sorry, components for any element that I want to present on a page, and I would just call that prop like any other HTML element, except now we're writing it in JSX. So here I could have maybe um, left arrow brackets header, name equals my blog, author equals Eric, date equals today's date. I could have a nav block. I could have my content block, and this is all just defined as components that I would call, elsewhere and separate things out nicely. So that's basically the idea of what we've got going on here. Now with props, with components, there's a lot more in depth in terms of statefulness, in terms of data flow and things of that nature. And we'll talk about that briefly. But key here is at its most basic, these are just little reusable elements. So here I've got a little bit more of a deeper example, and this is just something that I whipped up in CodePen, and I'm just going to show you the output rather than going into it. But the idea here is that, again, I define a component, right? So here's my hello there, passing in my properties, returning an element. So this is basically the same thing that I've got here, except now I'm going to roll this into my actual application. So I've got my component, or sorry, my app. Yeah, no, this would be my component, app, or application. No properties going into it. I'm going to return a div with 3 invocations of this particular component here. And we're kind of cascading our elements in a way, or our components. We're basically stacking them. We're getting into this notion of a hierarchy, basically. And what we see here, the output is basically going to be, okay, yes, I'm returning a div, and I have this little bar here. This is just a Google Slides thing. This isn't in my actual rendered output. But hello there, Eric. Hello there, student 1. Hello there, student 2. And then because prequel memes are still funny, it's going to return a h1, you're a bold one, inject the variable name, okay? And I've got 3 h1s being spit out here. And then what do we do when we go ahead and render? Now, instead of doing an element and defining it as a variable, like we did here, I'm just rendering this particular component directly. So this component gets rendered. It's going to have a dependency on these components based on what's inside here, but it's still just being spat out as basically HTML code at the very end. So that's kind of the whole idea here. And just for fun, I want to show you this anyway, because why not, right? So hopefully, settings, we're going to need Babel, we're going to need React. Nope, we're going to need React. We're going to need React DOM. Okay. Don't need CSS. Div ID equals container. Close our div. You know what? Let's just show that this is actually working. Slide you over a bit. Pound container. Background. What am I feeling today? Teal. Okay. Container, container, container. Okay. If we put something inside there, we should see there is my container, and teal's a little bit too dark. Let's make this, pound EE. Nice light gray. Okay, there we go. And while we're at it, let's give it a padding of 10px. I wasn't planning on doing this, but why not? Font size, 2 EMs. And now we can see it. Good enough. Get rid of the A because we don't want you there. Go away, A. All right. So let's define this now. I'm going to move this off screen just so I have a reference to it so I don't mistype anything, because in my old age, that tends to happen. So function, hello there, pass in our props. All right, return h1. I'm just going to do hi because I don't feel like typing that entire thing out. Props.name, h1, semicolon. Okay, so we have our first prop, and just to show you this is working, React DOM.render, we want a hello. Nope, let's do this. Let's do this the original way. Let lm equals h1 hello. Sorry, hello there. Name equals Eric. Render lm document.get element by ID container, and that should be good. What am I missing? What am I missing? Hello there. Props. H1. Okay. There should be content in here. I've got an error. Render is not a function. Yes, it is. Since when is it not a function? Am I missing a, let's fix this. I think I React dom, close. Yeah, okay. Just in my frantic typing earlier, I must have misincluded it. So there we go. There's our hierarchy. All right, now let's turn this into our actual component. So I've got my hello there function. Now let's define function app. Get out of the way. We don't have any props going into it. Return div. Might have to go back to JS Fiddle because I like the tidy coding. And we're going to say, I want a hello there, Eric. And let's do student1 just to match up, and student2. And we are no longer rendering this element down here. We are rendering our app. And now we should see a lot of stuff there. Okay, so this is exactly what I've got in the slides, basically. Now, just the difference, why I wanted to walk through it. We've got, again, a little bit of a hierarchy going on here. App is effectively our high-level component. It has dependencies on these sub-hello there. And we have our nice little output, right? Now, the thing I mentioned earlier about this variable name not mattering, I could call this super happy fun times, and I would just have to reference that appropriately. Okay, because it's just a variable name, right? Props is convention, it's not a requirement. So just a variable, that's all. Okay, let's go back to our slides now. So we've got that. Now, the thing I mentioned about the hierarchy and the dependencies, this is where you start getting into the notion of a tree-like structure with our components. Typically, you're going to have some high-level controlling element. All right, so you've got here in this example, app is going to be the root of this tree. So we're going to be at the very top. It's going to have dependencies on other elements. So in this example, I would have app up here, and then I would have 3 hello there's underneath it. And the idea basically is that each of these elements are going to have their own data. They're going to have their own notion of state. They're still going to be rendered, like however you define them to be rendered, right? So this could be, a Pinterest-like layout or a CS, whatever CSS you're using here. It doesn't matter. The thing that matters here is where data's going. And hopefully that makes sense in that quick little example. But this is the notion of our dependency graph. Before we talk about the data flow, though, just a couple of things to think about. These props are read-only. So when I define, let's go back to calling this prop, I shouldn't be modifying props.name inside of here. Okay, it's not something we need to do. I could say props.name equals, haha, I hacked you. See if it allows me to do it or not. Yeah, so it is possible. Just don't do it. It's going to break other things. I guess, oops, we don't want to see my recording list. Basically, don't modify them. One other thing that you can do, or you should do, is separate these things out. Now, everything I've been doing so far has all been self-contained in a single file, right? Everything has been in app.js. However, it's usually good practice to separate everything out. And what you're going to see is that you'll define a component in a file, and at the bottom you see like a call to export, whatever your component name's going to be. This makes it accessible to other files, and so that you can pull in that information. Is it necessary? Not strictly, especially if you have like a small application where you don't have a lot going on, but usually it's good practice to break things up. And if you want a good example, think of any Java, C++ application you've done where you've separated out the classes into other files, or you've defined header files, things of that nature, right? Keep your code nice and clean and separated, and ideally maintenance is a little bit better. I will do a separate demo on that one as well. So back to this idea of component flow and data flow. I've got a couple links here for you to check out, or actually I've got 3 of them. But the idea is that state and data flow is going downwards. So at the top of our tree, so this would be our app, and here we'd have all of our like hello there components, for instance, and then whatever's underneath that. If we were to extrapolate, data is going to start at the app, and it's going to trickle down to all of its children. right? So think of this root node as the head of our tree. It's getting all the data in and passing it down. If you have data that needs to be communicated back up, then you have to do something called hoisting or lifting your state up. And all that really means, it sounds really complicated and it's really not. Basically, if you have a common variable that you need to share, just raise that up a level or two. So if I'm defining some important attribute here, say, let's call this is our hello there, this is our app, right? So if name was super important for the head node to know, like for instance, if I was rendering something up here, but I'm defining it down here, I would just move that variable up here and make that part of the properties for this particular component. That's all it really is. Idea is just consider your components as a tree, and if you have data that needs to be shared, move it to a common ancestor, which is basically, this is a common ancestor of these two nodes here. Just raise it up a little bit. It's probably not going to impact anything, and yeah, it makes your life a little bit easier. Again, don't modify it directly. You're probably going to be allowed to based on your preprocessor and your compiler, but it's not a good practice. Some really weird things can start to happen, especially when we start talking about like asynchronous updates and fun things like that. The other bit of this little animation here is that state change is going to go be initiated at the bottom, but state data flow is going downwards. That's kind of what's going on here. Okay, events we have looked at already in terms of examples, but the idea here is basically that instead of calling button.onClick with lowercase, here it's button on camel case click, and then you're going to inject a component here for handling this event. So difference, they look very similar, which again is tricky if you're not used to this, but just to look at kind of the fine details, right? No quotes here, curly braces, camel case, button still defined as usual. Nice little example here at CodePen. This is not mine, by the way. I just grabbed this one off of the internet. But what you see here is a div. Oh, ID equals root. That's a good idea. All those times I was complaining about root not existing. Well, there you go. So we have a button here. I'm going to click it. It's going to toggle between off and on. What's going on is that I've got let's see, here's my toggle element. Toggle is this high-level component where basically there is a button. So this is the button that you see. Zoom in a touch just to make sure it's still visible. So we've got a onClick event, the state. We haven't talked about the state variable yet, but basically we're just toggling this little ternary function. If it is currently on, or sorry, if this is true, it is on, else it's off. The important bit here is this dot handle click. Basically, it's just referencing a function inside of this class. So definitely check this out if you want to play with events a bit. Now, one last bit, since this video is getting a bit long, I wanted to wrap this up. Again, I didn't go through everything. This is a intro to React. There's a lot of components to it. We could spend months going over this, honestly. The links that I've got for you from reactjs.org, just to kind of give you an example. I'm going to do a few demo videos on some of these just to show you them working, but I would honestly recommend going through them all just to get a feel for how things work in JSX and in React proper. But these are all kind of the basic things. And then especially there's this idea of state hoisting. There's the life cycle of data, right? Again, didn't talk about that really, but definitely worth checking out. So the last thing that I really wanted to what are we going to do with React? What can you build? We're going to spend pretty much the rest of the semester talking React or web-related things that are probably related to React. And the question is going to be, why would you use this? Anything front-end or mobile front-end driven is probably going to benefit from React. Now, again, yes, you could get all of this done with some jQuery, with, a Bootstrap implementation and some good HTML coding practices. But the idea is that this is probably something user interface driven and something where you don't want to deal with all the mundane coding under the hood. This is going to take care of a lot of the headaches for you. Yes, the learning curve can be a little bit steep, but that's like any technology, right? Just you have to get used to it and make it work. So what can we do with this? A lot of examples are chat applications, music players. I just linked a couple of like best of lists, so read this with a grain of salt, really. If you want to create your own Google Keep type of thing, there's one in here that I really liked. Was it this one? Social media. Oh, yeah, personal blog. So there is a application, or sorry, a framework called Gatsby, which you may or may not have heard of, but I've seen and I've tried making blogs with Gatsby with React, and it's really annoying and really frustrating to get things just right, know where all the files are. But once you have everything in place and it's ready to update, you can actually build some pretty cool things with it. Initially for this class, I was going to start to build a blog with Gatsby. I ran out of time before I had to start actually putting content together, but it was a very kind of interesting diversion. So if you're looking for a blog type application and you want to try something new, give Gatsby a look. Um, it is, I've got mixed feelings. I guess it's maddening at times, but it's interesting, and things that are interesting I find kind of fun to play with at least. So I would definitely recommend checking out the React.js links that I've got, and hope you all have a wonderful day. I will see you in some demo videos, and yeah, have a great week, everybody.